In Genesis 3:6, Genesis 3:6, sin entered into the world. Sin entered into the world, as recorded in Genesis 3:6, and the course of history would change forever. Just one generation later, in Genesis 4:8, accelerating the decline, the first murder is recorded, setting off a cycle of violence, coupled with apathy and betrayal, bringing us to the brink of self-destruction to this very hour, bringing humanity to the brink of destruction. In Genesis 4:9, in response to God for his actions, Cain questions God. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Can you believe it? Here's an individual that just committed the most heinous act up to this point in history, and when God calls him into question about it, he turns it around and he poses a question to God. A most audacious response, in my opinion, right to God's face. Right to God's face. He looks God in the face and he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" This is his answer to God after committing murder. This set the tone for the rest of history. This set the course of man's attitude towards man and God. Did God ever answer the question? Have you ever thought about that? Did God ever answer that question? God proceeded to tell Cain about the repercussions of his actions and what would follow, but he never answered that question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" directly to Cain's face. Let's begin this afternoon and explore that answer, because indeed God did answer that question. Let's start with the answer. Basically, the closest that you're going to get to a direct answer in 1 John 3. Let's turn to 1 John 3. And we're going to read just two verses here. We're going to read verse 11 and 12 of 1 John 3. Am I my brother's keeper? 1 John 3:11 states it this way: "For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." In verse 12, "Not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. It's worded that way in the New King James Version. Judging by his disposition towards God, and looking at John's expansion of this theme in chapters 4, verses 20 through 21, you can jot that down. You can turn there if you want. I think we can safely conclude that Cain had no love for God. He had no love for God himself. In the centuries between Genesis 4 And John's inspiration, both implicitly and explicitly, have shown us God's answer to Cain's question. You can turn there if you want to, but one of the precepts that we read in Leviticus 25:35 states, if one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty, then you shall help him, like a stranger or sojourner, that he may live with you. There are many, many occurrences in the Bible, in the Old and the New Testaments, in which God answers the question, are we our brother's keeper? God does not leave us dumbfounded. The whole entire Bible itself is an exercise of keeping our brother. Look at God requiring Obadiah to prophesy a curse on the house of Edom for violence inflicted on his brother Jacob's house. You find that in Obadiah 1:10-11. Obadiah 1:10-11 is a curse that God places on Edom for attacking his brother, and not just attacking his brother, but failing to come to his brother's aid. Another answer to the question that Cain audaciously put forward to God, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes. Yes, I am. Yes, you are. Interestingly, if you turn to Deuteronomy 23:7, read that very quick passage. God instructs the Israelite not to abhor the Edomite because he is your brother. And so there's no retribution to be taken from one brother to another. God takes retribution and judges as he sees fit, but not you and I. We do not have that prerogative. We do not have that right. That solely rests in the lap of God. Of course, we obviously have the 10 Commandments given to all mankind and given for mankind's edification, which themselves are summarized by Christ in Matthew 22:37-40, as loving God above all, and secondly, loving your neighbor or brother as yourself. It is clear from Scripture. It is very clear from Scripture. Read Matthew 25:35-40. We are both obligated and compelled to act on behalf of the physical, of the financial, of the emotional, mental, and ultimately the spiritual betterment of our brothers and sisters in and outside the faith. It could be said that the church itself is a manifestation of keeping your brother. I believe it is with this intent and with this thought in mind, way back in Genesis, that God had always intended to create the church to answer that question. The church is about keeping your brother and your sister. The church is a family. The church is a family. The church should be made up of physical families. Unfortunately, it has not always worked out that way. But primarily the church is an organism made up of physical and thus spiritual family members. I want to close by asking you to write down these two passages. I want you to write these two passages down. I want you to read them and meditate on the context of these two passages. It's two separate passages. They're talking about keeping your brother, but they're from two different aspects. I believe these are very, very important for our Christian walk. The first passage I want you to write down and study this, meditate on it, is Galatians 6:10. Do good to the household of faith. The second passage I want you to write down is 1 Timothy 5:8. 1 Timothy 5:8, provide for your own household. Galatians 6:10, do good to the household of faith. 1 Timothy 5:8, provide for your own household. Two cornerstones of humanity. God did answer Cain many times over. Throughout the scripture, it is both implicit and explicit. Either way, it is with an emphatic yes. Yes, we are our brother's keeper.